11-year-old murderer smiles in court, thinking he would walk free, until the judge said death penalty. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The Millbrook County Courthouse had never seen a day quite like this one. Standing at just 4'6", his feet barely touching the floor from the adult-sized chair, 11-year-old Eli Granger sat in the defendant's box. The orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his slender frame, making him appear even smaller than he was. His dark hair, neatly combed to the side, and his large brown eyes, scanning the room, gave him the appearance of any ordinary child who might be sitting in a classroom instead of a courtroom. My name is Martha Holloway, retired detective with 30 years on the force. I've seen cases that would make the toughest cops lose sleep, but nothing quite like the case of Eli Granger. The gallery was packed that morning. Reporters from national networks crowded the back row, their pens poised above notepads. Local residents who'd known the Palmer family for years sat rigid with disbelief. How could this happen in Millbrook, Indiana, population 8,742, where everyone knew their neighbors and crime was mostly limited to occasional shoplifting at the corner store? Judge Harold Simmons entered the courtroom, his face a mask of professional neutrality. But I knew Harold. We went to high school together. Even he, with 25 years on the bench, seemed troubled by the sight before him. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Simmons," the bailiff announced. The rustle of people standing filled the room. Eli rose too, his handcuffs clinking softly. His lawyer, state-appointed defender Mark Collins, placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You may be seated," Judge Simmons said, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent room. "We are here today for the final hearing in the case of the state versus Eli Granger." The cameras weren't allowed inside, but courtroom sketches captured what happened next. As the judge reviewed the charges so serious they had shocked the entire state, a subtle change came over Eli's face. The frightened, vulnerable look that had characterized his previous appearances melted away. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. He smiled. It wasn't the nervous smile of a child. There was something knowing in it, something that made even seasoned court reporters shift uncomfortably in their seats. He looked, for all the world, like someone who knew a secret no one else did. Victoria Palmer, Eli's adoptive mother, sat in the front row behind the defense table. Her once perfect appearance had deteriorated over the 6 months since her family's life imploded. Her husband Richard was notably absent, for reasons that would soon become clear to everyone. "Before I deliver my decision," Judge Simmons continued, adjusting his glasses, "I want to make it clear that this court has taken into consideration the defendant's age and all relevant psychological evaluations." Eli's smile widened. He turned to his lawyer and whispered something. Collins frowned and shook his head, but Eli just turned back toward the judge, that strange confidence still radiating from him. He thought he was going home today. But Judge Simmons had other plans. Plans that would set in motion one of the most extraordinary legal proceedings in Indiana's history. No one in that courtroom could have predicted how deeply this case would force us to question everything we thought we knew about family, truth, and justice. What turned an adopted child from a respected family into a defendant in an orange jumpsuit? And why was he smiling? To answer that, we need to go back 6 months earlier, to the day when the perfect facade of the Palmer family first began to crack. 6 months earlier, the Palmer residence stood as the crown jewel of Millbrook's Heritage Oak subdivision. A red brick colonial with white columns and perfectly manicured hedges, it represented everything the small Indiana town admired: success, stability, and family values. On the morning of January 12th, Richard Palmer sat at the breakfast table, reviewing legal briefs while Victoria poured orange juice for Eli. Security footage from their smart home system, later subpoenaed as evidence, showed what appeared to be a normal family scene. "The Palmers were Millbrook royalty," explains Sheriff Dennis Cooper, leaning back in his chair as we conduct our interview in his modest office. Richard handled estate planning for half the town. Victoria treated their kids since birth. Everyone trusted them. That trust extended to their decision to adopt Eli 2 years earlier. The town had watched the Palmers foster the quiet, dark-haired boy, then celebrated when the adoption became official. Local newspapers covered the story as a heartwarming tale of second chances. They seemed like the perfect match, says Elizabeth Bennett, Eli's fifth-grade teacher. In interview footage, she fidgets with her necklace, visibly uncomfortable with hindsight. Eli was exceptionally bright, tested in the gifted range. The Palmers had the resources to nurture that potential. At 10:42 that morning, a call came into the Millbrook Police Department. Harriet Wilson's home health aide had arrived to find the 84-year-old widow unconscious on her living room floor. The medication dispenser was empty. Her breathing was shallow. Mrs. Wilson lived 3 doors down from the Palmers, Sheriff Cooper explains, spreading out crime scene photos on his desk. Wealthy widow, no children. Her late husband founded Wilson Manufacturing back in the UA 60s. The ambulance arrived within 7 minutes. As paramedics worked to stabilize Mrs. Wilson, something caught aide Meredith Jackson's attention. A child-sized footprint in the spilled tea beside the ottoman. I remember thinking it was strange, Jackson tells us, her voice wavering slightly. Mrs. Wilson didn't have grandchildren or young visitors that I knew of, and it was a school day. Sheriff Cooper was called to the scene when paramedics noticed irregularities in Mrs. Wilson's medication situation. The pills in her dispenser didn't match her prescription bottles. Someone had tampered with her medications. Harriet Wilson was the 3rd wealthiest person in Millbrook, Cooper says. When someone with that kind of money has a suspicious medical emergency, we take notice. Security footage from Mrs. Wilson's doorbell camera, installed by her nephew the previous Christmas, showed a figure approaching the house at 8:17 that morning, when Mrs. Wilson would have been having breakfast alone. The figure wore a hooded jacket and kept their head down. The height was consistent with a child or small teenager, Cooper explains, pausing the footage. But at that point, we weren't looking at Eli Granger. We were checking every angle. That changed when deputies canvassing the neighborhood noticed Eli Palmer hadn't been in school that morning. Victoria had called him in sick, but a neighbor reported seeing him riding his bike toward the Wilson house around 2:59. At 2:30 p.m., Sheriff Cooper pulled into the Palmer driveway. Richard came home from his law office when Cooper called, meeting him at the door. "I'm here about Harriet Wilson," Cooper said. "I'd like to speak with your son." The home security footage shows Richard's confident smile. "Of course, Sheriff, but my son couldn't possibly be involved. Eli's been home sick all day." That's when an officer noticed fresh mud on a pair of sneakers by the door, sneakers with a tread pattern matching the footprint in Mrs. Wilson's living room. Richard's smile disappeared, and in Eli's room upstairs, deputies would soon discover something that would change everything. A notebook filled with detailed observations of Mrs. Wilson's daily routine, medication schedule, and a note that simply read, "She changed her will last week. Dad says that's good for us." To understand Eli Granger, you have to understand where he came from. Before the Palmer mansion with its manicured lawn, before the private piano lessons and monogrammed backpacks, Eli's life was marked by tragedy and transience. "The accident happened on Route 37, explains Nancy Blackwell, thumbing through a worn case file in her small office at Indiana Child Services. 22 years as a social worker have left her eyes tired but observant. Eli was 4. His parents, biological parents, were driving home from a movie when a semi crossed the median. The crash killed David and Lisa Granger instantly. Eli, secured in his car seat, survived with only minor injuries. With no living relatives willing to take him in, he entered the foster care system. He was a beautiful child," Nancy says, sliding across a photograph of a solemn-faced boy with dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything. Quiet, observant, too observant, sometimes. Between ages 4 and 9, Eli moved through 5 foster homes. The reasons for each transition varied: foster parents relocating, health issues, or simply not a good fit. The bureaucratic euphemism that can hide a multitude of complications. Samuel Davis, Eli's 3rd foster parent, agreed to meet us at a diner on the outskirts of Indianapolis. A construction foreman with calloused hands and a direct gaze, he fostered over a dozen children over 15 years. Most kids who come through the system are traumatized, confused, Davis says, stirring his coffee methodically. Eli was different. He watched everything, learned systems quickly, figured out what adults wanted to hear. Davis pauses, choosing his words carefully. There was an incident with our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Kravitz. She had this collection of antique silver spoons. Valuable. They started disappearing. We thought maybe it was memory issues at first. She was in her 80s. The spoons turned up in Eli's room, hidden inside a hollowed-out children's book. When we confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just said, "Mrs. Kravitz said I could have them when she dies. I was just keeping them safe." The way he said it, so calm, so reasonable. That's what stays with me. 2 weeks later, Eli was moved to another home. These early incidents never entered his official record. They were dismissed as misunderstandings, the actions of a grieving child seeking security through possessions. Each new home meant a clean slate, a common problem in an overburdened system where information often doesn't follow children properly. By the time Richard and Victoria Palmer became interested in fostering Eli, his file contained only vague references to attachment difficulties and needs consistent. Boundaries, bureaucratic understatements that failed to capture the pattern emerging across his placements. The Palmers seemed ideal on paper, Nancy Blackwell acknowledges. Wealthy, stable, educated. They had resources most foster parents don't. We thought Eli had finally caught a break. What the system didn't know was why the Palmers, after years of focusing on their careers, suddenly wanted to become parents. The official story, that Victoria, unable to have biological children, felt called to help a child in need, made for good local newspaper coverage and community approval. The truth was more complicated. Sheriff Cooper's investigation would later uncover emails between Richard and his financial advisor, expressing concern about the Palmers' standing in the Millbrook Preservation Society, an exclusive social club where membership required family lineage or significant contributions to community legacy. Richard was obsessed with that club, says Thomas Reynolds, Richard's former law partner. Old money runs Millbrook, and Richard wasn't old money. He was new money trying to buy his way in. Adopting a child, especially one from unfortunate circumstances, offered the perfect narrative. Successful professional couple gives back through adoption. The Preservation Society loved that kind of story. What no one anticipated was how perfectly Eli would understand and exploit his new family's motivations. When Sheriff Cooper returned to the station with Eli's notebook detailing Mrs. Wilson's routines, he made a call to Nancy Blackwell. Her response was immediate. Check his previous placements. Check if there were any incidents with elderly neighbors. That night, as Mrs. Wilson lay unconscious in the hospital, Cooper began connecting dots that would, reveal a pattern stretching back years, a pattern that raised a disturbing question. Was Eli a victim of manipulation by his adoptive parents, or had the Palmers unwittingly welcomed something dangerous into their perfect home? The answer would be found in a storage unit rented under Victoria, Palmer's maiden name, containing items that should never have been in her possession, including a collection of antique silver spoons. Millbrook Middle School sits on a gentle hill overlooking the town, its brick facade and American flag presenting an image of stability and normalcy. Inside the guidance counselor's office, James Turner had kept meticulous notes on every student who passed through his door during his 15-year tenure. His file on Eli Granger would become critical to understanding what happened at the Palmer house. Eli wasn't like other troubled kids I've counseled, Turner explains, his bow tie and cardigan giving him the appearance of a professor rather than a school counselor. They typically act out, withdraw, or show obvious signs of distress. Eli performed, there's no better word for it, he performed normalcy. Turner slides across a folder containing Eli's academic records, straight A's, perfect attendance until the incident, and glowing teacher comments about his politeness and focus. But in our one-on-one sessions, I noticed something unusual. His emotional responses felt rehearsed. If I asked about his feelings regarding the adoption, he'd tilt his head slightly, pause for exactly 2 seconds, and deliver what sounded like a perfectly crafted answer about gratitude and belonging. When asked if he shared these observations with the Palmers, Turner sighs. Richard Palmer was on the school board. Victoria was the town's most respected pediatrician. You don't tell people like that their child might be, he hesitates, searching for the right word, adaptable in concerning ways. Sheriff Cooper's investigation took a significant turn when security footage emerged from the public library across from Mrs. Wilson's street. The grainy, video showed a small figure in a hooded jacket crossing toward Wilson's house at 8:17 a.m., exactly when Eli was supposed to be homesick. The height, gait, and backpack matched Eli, Cooper explains, pointing to the enhanced footage. But what really caught our attention was the deliberate way he kept his face turned away from every camera on the route. That suggests premeditation. When confronted with this evidence, Victoria Palmer became visibly distressed. "My son was homesick," she insisted in her initial statement. "Richard must have taken him out while I was at my morning yoga class." But Richard's law firm confirmed he was in a client meeting from 7:30 to 9:15 that morning, with multiple witnesses. Their stories didn't align, Cooper says, and that's when we started looking deeper into their finances. What they discovered shattered the perfect image of the Palmer family. Despite their apparent wealth, the Palmers were leveraged to the breaking point. Richard's law practice had suffered when several major clients left following a mishandled estate case. Victoria's medical practice was struggling with insurance disputes. Their mortgage was underwater and credit card debt had spiraled to nearly $200,000. Yet they maintained their country club membership, their luxury cars, their position on every important town committee. Image was everything to the Palmers. When we examined Richard's legal client list, another connection emerged. Cooper continues. He had been handling Harriet Wilson's estate planning for the past 5 years. 3 months before the incident, she had amended her will. The amendment named the Palmer Family Foundation for Children in Need as the beneficiary of Wilson's estate, approximately $2.4 million in assets, and her historic home, a foundation that, records would show, existed primarily on paper and channeled most of its limited funds back to the Palmers as administrative expenses. The conflict of interest was glaring, says District Attorney Sarah Morrison. Richard Palmer drafting a will that essentially left millions to himself through a shell foundation. That alone would trigger an ethics investigation. But the case took another turn when Mrs. Wilson unexpectedly regained consciousness 3 days after being admitted to Millbrook Memorial Hospital. Her attending physician, Dr. Gregory Patel, immediately contacted Sheriff Cooper. Her first words were, "Where's my little helper?" Dr. Patel recalls. "When I asked who she meant, she said, 'The Palmer boy. He brings me tea every Wednesday.'" This contradicted Victoria's statement that Eli and Mrs. Wilson barely knew each other beyond occasional neighborly waves. It suggested a deliberate relationship had been cultivated. But by whom? Cooper arranged to interview Mrs. Wilson, hoping her testimony would clarify Eli's involvement. Her room was placed under police protection, and only medical staff were allowed entry. That evening, Cooper received an urgent call from Victoria Palmer requesting a private meeting away from her home and husband. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I need protection. I think Richard is using our son to do something terrible." But as Cooper would soon discover, Victoria's tearful confession wasn't the breakthrough it appeared to be. The hospital's pharmacy records would reveal something far more disturbing about Mrs. Wilson's medications, and who had access to them. Mrs. Wilson's medical chart showed a pattern of unusual prescription changes in the months before her collapse. Changes authorized by her primary care physician, Dr. Victoria Palmer. Behind the Palmer family's public image, a different reality existed within the walls of their home. To understand this contrast, investigators turned to those who had witnessed the family's private moments. Margaret Sims worked as the Palmers' housekeeper for 3 years, including the entire time Eli lived with them. Initially reluctant to speak with authorities, she eventually agreed to an interview when assured her immigration status wouldn't be questioned. They were different people when no one was watching, Margaret explains, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mr. Palmer, he was always checking the security cameras, making sure everything looked perfect from the outside. But inside, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The Palmer home's extensive security system, installed ostensibly for Protection functioned more as surveillance. Cameras monitored every room except bedrooms and bathrooms. Richard reviewed the footage regularly, critiquing everything from Victoria's interactions with guests to Eli's posture at the dinner table. The boy learned fast, Margaret continues. He'd be one person when the cameras were on, perfect manners, big smiles, then different when they were off. I once saw him practicing facial expressions in the mirror, like he was rehearsing. When he noticed me watching, he just said, "Dad likes it when I look happy at dinner." While Cooper's team analyzed the Palmer's home videos, he personally conducted the critical interview with Mrs. Wilson at the hospital. Her fragmented memory complicated matters, side effects of her condition and medication, but certain details remained clear in her mind. "Eli brings me tea on Wednesdays," she confirmed, her voice thin but certain. Such a thoughtful boy, not like his father. When Cooper asked what she meant about Richard, her expression darkened. "Always talking about my money, my house, my collections. The boy at least pretends to care about me." Most significantly, Mrs. Wilson recalled someone adjusting her medication dispenser during her weekly bridge game. "I thought it was Victoria. She said the pharmacy had changed my prescription. She's a doctor. Why would I question her?" As Cooper left the hospital, his phone rang with an update from the forensics team. Richard Palmer's financial troubles went deeper than initially thought. Despite outward appearances of wealth, credit reports showed multiple rejected loan applications. The most recent rejection had come just 3 weeks before Mrs. Wilson's collapse. Meanwhile, Victoria had discovered something on Richard's laptop that had visibly disturbed her. Security footage showed her late at night, accessing Richard's computer while he slept, then backing away from the screen with her hand covering her mouth in shock. Cooper obtained a warrant for the laptop, but when deputies arrived to collect it, Richard claimed it had been stolen during a break-in that very morning. A break-in he had mysteriously failed to report until that moment. What Victoria had seen on that computer would remain a mystery for now, but her reaction, captured clearly on their own security cameras, suggested she had discovered something that changed everything she thought she knew about her husband or her son. That evening, as Cooper reviewed the case notes in his office, the hospital called. Mrs. Wilson's condition had suddenly deteriorated, and on the security footage from her room, a figure in scrubs had been seen entering briefly during shift change, a figure whose face was never shown to the camera, but whose height matched that of a child, not an adult. Millbrook prides itself on community values, church potlucks, 4th of July parades, and neighbors who know each other's business, sometimes better than they should, yet beneath this Norman Rockwell surface, secrets fester like the black mold discovered in the elementary school basement last year, hidden, toxic, and spreading unseen. Olivia Carter has taught piano to Millbrook's children for over 30 years. Her sunroom studio, with its worn bench and meticulously maintained Steinway, has hosted generations of reluctant students and the occasional prodigy. Eli Granger, she insists, was neither. He was technically proficient, Olivia says, adjusting her reading glasses. He could reproduce anything I played, almost instantly. But there was something mechanical about it. No emotion, no mistakes. What makes Olivia's testimony valuable isn't just her musical assessment, but the recording she made of each lesson, a practice she began years ago to help students track their progress. "Listen," she says, playing an audio file on her ancient laptop. "We cool hear scales." Then Olivia's voice suggesting a break. What follows is unexpected. Eli's voice, high but measured, talking about his home life. "Dad says we need to do what's best for the family." The recording captures him saying, "Sometimes that means helping people who don't know they need help." Yet, when Olivia asked what he meant, his response was cryptic. "Like Mrs. Wilson, she has so much, but she's all alone. Dad says she'd be happier knowing her money is helping a family instead of just sitting in a bank." Olivia didn't think much of it at the time. Children repeat things without understanding them, she explains. But looking back, his tone was unsettling, like he was reciting lines he'd practiced. As Cooper's investigation continued, Dr. Eleanor Freeman, a child psychologist appointed by the court, began regular sessions with Eli. Her initial reports described a cooperative child who showed appropriate emotional responses, perhaps too appropriate. His behaviors are textbook, she noted in her confidential assessment. When discussing his adoptive parents, he displays exactly the right amount of attachment. When discussing Mrs. Wilson, exactly the right amount of concern. It's as if he studied how he should respond. In their third session, Dr. Freeman noticed inconsistencies in Eli's stories, small details that shifted between tellings. When gently confronted, Eli didn't become defensive as most children would. Instead, he smiled and said, "Adults always blame children when things go wrong. It's easier that way." Meanwhile, the local media had transformed the Palmer case into a sensation. The Millbrook Gazette's headline, "Perfect Family Facade Hides Dark Secrets," was mild compared to the national outlets that descended on the town. Cable news vans lined Main Street, and reporters ambushed school board members for quotes about Richard Palmer's character. The coverage largely portrayed Eli as either a victim of manipulation or a disturbed child, with little nuance between. Few reporters questioned why Victoria Palmer had been Mrs. Wilson's doctor despite clear conflict of interest concerns, or why the adoption had been approved despite red flags in Eli's history. When Cooper arrived at the Palmer home to execute another search warrant, Victoria met him at the door, visibly distressed. Sheriff's Department body cam footage captures the moment. "I need to talk to you," she whispers, glancing back toward the house. "Privately, I think Richard is using our son. I found something, evidence that he's been planning this for years, but I'm afraid." Cooper arranges for Victoria to come to the station later that evening, but the interview never happens. As Victoria pulls out of her driveway, the camera captures Eli watching from his bedroom window, his expression unreadable. By morning, Mrs. Wilson would suffer a catastrophic second collapse, and Victoria Palmer would have disappeared, leaving behind only a cryptic, "Note, he knows what we did." The question that haunted Cooper, which he was she referring to? The search of Richard Palmer's home office revealed a man obsessed with appearances and control. Behind the mahogany desk and law degrees hung in heavy frames, Cooper's team discovered a hidden wall safe, concealed by a replica Hopper painting. "Most people hide their valuables," Cooper explains, turning the combination dial in crime scene footage. Palmer hid evidence of who he really was. Inside the safe, falsified financial statements prepared for country club membership, rejected loan applications, and a folder of letters from Harriet Wilson expressing increasing concern about her estate management. "Richard, I don't understand why the Thompson property was sold below market value," one letter read, "and these administrative fees for the foundation seem excessive. Perhaps we should review our arrangement." The letter was dated 3 weeks before Mrs. Wilson's collapse. When confronted with this evidence, Richard's carefully maintained composure cracked. "You're looking at the wrong person," he insisted during his interrogation. "Have you checked Victoria's prescription records? She's the doctor. She's the one with access to medications." Court records from neighboring counties revealed an unsettling pattern that had gone unnoticed in the fragmented juvenile justice system. 3 similar cases involving wealthy families with adopted children had been quietly settled in the past decade, all involving elderly neighbors who had changed their wills shortly before medical emergencies or deaths ruled as natural causes. "The system is designed to protect family privacy," explains former Judge William Hargrove in a rare interview, "especially when prominent community members are involved. Cases involving juveniles are sealed. Settlements include NDAs. The pattern only becomes visible when you know exactly what you're looking for." As Cooper dug deeper, archived footage from Millbrook Hospital's security system captured something disturbing. When informed about Mrs. Wilson's deteriorating condition, Eli's reaction wasn't what anyone expected from an 11-year-old. His face remained completely blank for several seconds before he covered it with his hands and began to cry. A transition so abrupt it appeared rehearsed. Dr. Freeman noted this. In her psychological assessment, Eli displays delayed emotional processing, followed by exaggerated expression, consistent with someone performing emotions rather than experiencing them naturally. Meanwhile, Cooper executed a warrant on Richard's law office. What they found confirmed their Suspicions about the Palmer Family Foundation. It existed primarily on paper, with minimal charitable activities. Most funds were redirected to the Palmers through various expense categories. But the most damning evidence came from Mrs. Wilson herself. In the hours before her second collapse, she had been lucid enough to sign a new statement with her nurse as witness. She described Richard's increasing interest in her estate over the previous year, Victoria's unexplained changes to her medication, and most disturbingly, Eli's regular Wednesday visits. "The boy brings tea and sits with me," her statement read. "He asks about my collections, my family history. Recently, he asked if I'd considered how my assets would be distributed when I'm gone. He said, 'Dad thinks you should leave it to people who can really use it, not distant relatives who never visit you.' When I seemed upset, he immediately changed the subject and became the sweet boy again." The following morning, Mrs. Wilson suffered a second, more severe medical emergency. Hospital toxicology reports would later confirm lethal levels of medication in her system, medication that didn't match her prescription. As this news reached the sheriff's department, another call came in. Richard Palmer's assistant had discovered something alarming while organizing his digital files. A series of emails between Richard and Victoria discussing our investment in Eli and ensuring Wilson's assets are secured before the audit. These emails were dated from before they had even begun fostering Eli. But most disturbing was the attached document, a half-completed will for Harriet Wilson, prepared by Richard 6 months before they began fostering Eli, already naming the yet-to-be-formed Palmer Family Foundation as primary beneficiary. Cooper now had evidence of premeditation. What he didn't have was Victoria Palmer, who remained missing until her credit card was used at a motel 40 miles outside of Millbrook. Millbrook's affluent west side is home to more than just the Palmer residence. The prestigious Palmer Foundation headquarters occupies a converted Victorian on Maple Street, its brass plaque and manicured grounds projecting legitimacy and permanence. But like many things in this case, appearances were deceiving. The foundation was essentially a shell, explains forensic accountant Diane Levitz, who examined its financial records. 93% of donations went to administrative expenses, consulting fees, and property management, all flowing back to Palmer-controlled accounts. Behind the charitable facade, the foundation had facilitated 7 adoptions over the past decade, all following a similar pattern: wealthy couples adopting children who were then placed in homes near elderly residents with substantial estates. The adoption records were technically legal, Cooper notes, but showed concerning shortcuts. Background checks conducted by firms with connections to Richard, home studies rushed through the system, psychological evaluations that glossed over red flags. Nancy Blackwell's deeper investigation into Eli's case revealed disturbing omissions. His full history wasn't disclosed to the Palmers, or so we thought. Records of concerning behaviors at previous placements were minimized or excluded entirely, but emails recovered from Richard's computer suggested the Palmers knew more than they claimed. In one message to Victoria, Richard wrote, "His background is perfect for our needs. Already shows the patterns we can work with. Just needs structure and the right incentives." Thomas Reynolds, Richard's former business partner, provided crucial context about the man behind the facade. Richard was obsessed with status, Reynolds explains from his new office in Indianapolis. His father was a factory worker, his mother a waitress. He clawed his way into Princeton on scholarship, then spent the rest of his life trying to convince everyone he belonged in circles that would never truly accept him. This obsession with acceptance drove Richard to pursue membership in the Millbrook Preservation Society, the town's oldest and most exclusive social organization. Founded by the original manufacturing families who built Millbrook, membership required either bloodline or exceptional community contributions. The society controlled everything that mattered to Richard, Reynolds continues. Country club admissions, business, connections, social standing. When they suggested the town needed a foundation supporting adoption, suddenly Richard became passionate about foster children. The investigation also uncovered a pattern of elderly deaths connected to Palmer Foundation families. 5 cases in 3 counties over 8 years. Each followed a similar trajectory. An adopted child placed with a wealthy family, relationship developed with an elderly neighbor, changes to wills and estates, followed by medical emergencies ruled as natural causes. The system is designed to miss these connections, Cooper explains. Juvenile records are sealed. Cases cross jurisdictional boundaries. Unless someone is specifically looking for the pattern, it remains hidden. Cooper's team discovered Victoria's last phone call before disappearing was to a burner phone purchased with cash at a truck stop. Cell tower data placed the receiving phone at a storage facility on the edge of Millbrook. The storage unit, rented under Victoria's maiden name, contained a disturbing collection: prescription pads, medication samples, and mementos from elderly residents who had died, including Mrs. Kravitz's silver spoons from Eli's previous foster home. Most damning was a notebook in Victoria's handwriting detailing candidate properties with elderly owners, their estimated net worth, and notes about their family relationships and health conditions. One entry was circled in red: Wilson Estate, 2.4 million plus historic home. No. Close family. Richard managing legal affairs. Perfect candidate for Phase 2. As Cooper processed this evidence, Victoria's credit card was used again, this time at a gas station heading toward the state line. Security footage showed she wasn't alone. Seated in the passenger seat wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses but still recognizable was Eli. The question now facing investigators: was Victoria fleeing with a victim or with an accomplice? The answer would begin to emerge when Eli requested to speak with authorities alone, claiming 5 chilling words. I know what really happened. The interrogation room at the Millbrook Sheriff's Department is deliberately austere. Beige walls, metal table bolted to the floor, and a 2-way mirror reflecting the anxiety of those who sit facing it. For Eli Granger, however, it seemed to hold no intimidation. "I need protection from my dad," he said, his voice steady despite tears streaming down his face. The camera captured a child who appeared simultaneously vulnerable and composed, an unsettling contradiction that wouldn't be fully understood until much later. Sheriff Cooper and Dr. Freeman sat across from him, a child advocate present. As required by law, the recording of this interview would become a pivotal piece of evidence. "My dad made me help him," Eli continued, wiping tears with his sleeve. "He said if I didn't, he'd send me back to foster care. He said nobody would want me anymore." What followed was a detailed account of Richard Palmer's alleged scheme, how he'd instructed Eli to befriend Mrs. Wilson, to mention the foundation during their weekly tea sessions, to subtly influence her thinking about her estate. "Dad gave me a special tea to bring her. He said it had vitamins to help her feel better, but it made her sleepy instead." Eli's description included specifics about the medication's appearance and the distinctive jar Richard allegedly used to store it. Details later confirmed when the jar was found in Richard's garage with his fingerprints. "When Mrs. Wilson changed her will, Dad took me for ice cream. He said we were a good team." Eli's testimony, delivered with occasional sobs and perfect emotional timing, painted Richard as a manipulative mastermind and himself as a frightened child, desperate for stability. "And what about your mom?" Cooper asked gently. "She tried to protect me," Eli said, his expression shifting to one of concern. "When she found out what Dad was doing, she said we had to leave. She said we'd tell the police everything." This testimony aligned perfectly with Victoria's disappearance. When authorities located her at a motel near the state line, she corroborated Eli's account, adding that she'd discovered Richard's scheme only recently through files on his laptop. "I couldn't believe he would use our son this way," she said through tears in her own recorded statement. "What kind of monster involves a child in something like this?" With both testimonies aligning and physical evidence supporting their claims, the district attorney moved quickly. Richard Palmer was arrested and charged with multiple felonies: exploitation of an elderly person, fraud, endangering the welfare of a minor, and following Mrs. Wilson's death 3 days later, involuntary manslaughter. The case seemed resolved. Local media praised Cooper's thorough investigation. The community rallied around Victoria and Eli as victims of Richard's manipulation and greed. A judge granted Victoria a temporary order of protection against Richard, and she filed for divorce the same day. In a town hall meeting, Mayor Jenkins commended the sheriff's department while acknowledging the black eye the case had given Millbrook. "But we can heal knowing justice has been served," he assured residents. Cooper was celebrated for solving the case, receiving commendations from the county and interview requests from true crime programs. The evidence against Richard appeared overwhelming, but something continued to bother Cooper. Small inconsistencies that nagged at his investigator's instinct. Why had Eli's fingerprints been found on Mrs. Wilson's medication dispenser when his story suggested only Richard had tampered with it? Why had Victoria, a physician, not recognized signs of medication tampering sooner? And why had the storage unit with damning evidence been rented 3 years before the Palmers even met Eli? As the prosecution prepared for Richard's trial, forensic results from Mrs. Wilson's home delivered the first crack in the seemingly perfect case. DNA evidence recovered from the teacup found at the scene of her collapse didn't match Richard's profile. It matched Victoria's. Sheriff Dennis Cooper had built his career on methodical investigation, rather than intuition. But the Victoria Palmer DNA match struck him as more than just an unexpected development. It felt like the first honest piece in a puzzle of performances. The case was too clean, Cooper explains, spreading case files across his desk 3 years after the events. Every piece of evidence against Richard fit perfectly. In 26 years of law enforcement, I've never seen a guilty person leave such a perfect trail. The DNA results forced Cooper to reconsider everything, despite mounting pressure from the district attorney's office to proceed with the case against Richard. Cooper instead began quietly pursuing alternate leads, starting with a deeper investigation into Victoria's background. "I was risking my career," he admits. The town had already convicted Richard in the court of public opinion. Victoria and Eli were the sympathetic victims everyone was rooting for. Suggesting otherwise made me very unpopular. Cooper's first breakthrough came from revisiting Eli's previous foster placements, not just reviewing files but personally interviewing former foster parents and neighbors. In 3 separate homes, he discovered a pattern. Elderly neighbors who had experienced medical emergencies or unexplained deaths. None had been investigated as suspicious at the time. The common denominator wasn't Richard Palmer, Cooper says. It was Eli. Meanwhile, Victoria had become increasingly protective of Eli, limiting Cooper's access and insisting a child psychologist be present for any questions. Dr. Freeman noted concerning patterns in her sessions with Eli, subtle inconsistencies in his stories and emotional responses that seemed calibrated for maximum impact rather than reflecting genuine trauma. "He presents as the perfect victim," Dr. Freeman noted in her confidential assessment. "Too perfect. Real trauma is messy, his responses feel researched." Pressure mounted on Cooper from multiple directions. The mayor questioned why he was harassing a victim and his mother instead of focusing on the prosecution of Richard. The district attorney threatened to proceed without Cooper's cooperation. Even his own deputies expressed concerns about his fixation on disproving the established narrative. "Only my wife believed in what I was doing," Cooper recalls. "She said, 'Dennis, I've never seen you doubt yourself like this. If your gut says, something's wrong, something's wrong.'" The turning point came when Cooper obtained financial records through a little-used provision in the Patriot Act, bypassing the usual warrant process that had been repeatedly blocked by judges sympathetic to Victoria. These records revealed something shocking. Victoria Palmer, not Richard, was deeply in debt, owing nearly $500,000 to various casinos and online gambling sites. She had a gambling addiction she'd hidden from everyone, including her husband, Cooper explains. And she'd been siphoning money from their joint accounts and Richard's law practice to cover it. Further investigation revealed Victoria had used her medical credentials to access prescription medications that matched those found in Mrs. Wilson's system. As a pediatrician, Victoria wouldn't normally prescribe these medications, but she had privileges at Millbrook Memorial that gave her access to the pharmacy. Cooper was building a case for an alternate theory when he received an anonymous package containing a USB drive. On it was footage from the Palmer home's security system, footage that had been deleted from the main server but backed up to Richard's cloud account. The video showed Victoria coaching Eli before his interview with authorities, rehearsing his tearful testimony about Richard's alleged scheme. "Remember to cry after you mention the tea," Victoria instructed. "And don't forget, Dad threatened to send you back if you didn't. Help him." Eli's response chilled Cooper to the bone. "I know how to make them believe me, Mom. I've done this before." The case against Richard Palmer collapsed like a house of cards in a sudden breeze. The bombshell video evidence forced the district attorney to drop all charges, issuing a terse statement citing new exculpatory evidence. Richard walked free after 63 days in county jail, emerging haggard and visibly aged, the polish of his former life stripped away by his time behind bars. "I knew Victoria had problems," Richard told reporters gathered outside the courthouse. "But I never imagined she was capable of this. And Eli? I still don't understand what happened to my son." The revelation sent shockwaves through Millbrook. The same community that had vilified Richard now scrambled to make sense of this dramatic reversal. Local news coverage shifted overnight. Previous headlines about attorney's evil plot replaced with pediatrician's web of lies, and child used as pawn in deadly scheme. Cooper's investigation now centered on Victoria Palmer, but she had disappeared again after being informed of Richard's imminent release. This time, she had left Eli behind with his court-appointed guardian, vanishing with a head start of nearly 12 hours before anyone realized she was gone. "She knew we were closing in," Cooper explains. "The DNA evidence, the financial records, the video. It was only a matter of time before we had enough for an arrest warrant." The most disturbing discovery came when Nancy Blackwell unsealed Eli's complete juvenile records, revealing a pattern that had been deliberately obscured during the adoption process. Sealed reports from 3 previous placements documented concerning behaviors: manipulation, lack of empathy, and a pattern of cultivating relationships with vulnerable elderly neighbors. "The system failed everyone," Blackwell acknowledges, her voice heavy with regret. "These red flags were buried because everyone wanted a success story. The wealthy couple saving the troubled child. It was too perfect a narrative to question." Banking records revealed the true extent of Victoria's financial desperation. Her gambling addiction had spiraled out of control in the years before Eli's adoption, with losses exceeding $600,000, far more than her pediatric practice could cover. Credit card debt, high-interest loans, and mounting pressure from collection agencies painted a picture of a woman on the brink of financial ruin. Victoria wasn't just gambling with cards, Cooper observes. She was gambling with lives, Mrs. Wilson's, Richard's, and in a way, Eli's too. Forensic analysis of the medications found in Mrs. Wilson's system matched samples from Victoria's medical bag, with her fingerprints on the containers. The teacup at Wilson's home contained traces of the same medications, along with Victoria's DNA from the rim and handle. Most damning was evidence that Victoria had been prescribing unusual medications to her own patients, including controlled substances in questionable amounts. Records from the state pharmacy board showed she had received warnings about her prescribing patterns, but used her position and reputation to avoid formal investigation. Richard, now cooperating fully with authorities, provided access to all their accounts and communications. "I was blind," he admitted in his statement. "I knew Victoria was struggling with something, but she kept me focused on our social standing, on the foundation, on creating the perfect image. Meanwhile, she was orchestrating everything from behind the scenes." Cooper's team tracked Victoria's cell phone to a cabin near Lake Michigan, but by the time local authorities arrived, she had already fled. She had left behind one item, a handwritten note addressed to Eli that read simply, "They'll never understand what we had to do. Remember the plan." As the investigation intensified, another critical piece of evidence emerged: security footage from Millbrook Hospital, showing a small figure in scrubs entering Mrs. Wilson's room shortly before her fatal collapse. The face wasn't visible, but height. Analysis indicated the person stood exactly 4'6", Eli's precise height. We had been asking the wrong question all along, Cooper realizes. It wasn't whether Victoria or Richard was manipulating Eli. The question was, what if Eli had been manipulating them both? The relationship between Victoria, Palmer and Eli Granger wasn't what anyone had assumed. As Cooper dug deeper, a disturbing codependency emerged. Not the conventional bond between mother and adopted son, but something far more calculated. Victoria deliberately sought out a child with attachment issues, Richard explained during an extensive debriefing at the sheriff's office. His hair had grown out unevenly during his jail time, his designer clothes replaced by department store basics. She researched adoption agencies specializing in challenging placements. When she found Eli, she called him perfect. Medical records revealed Victoria had prescribed various medications to Eli, despite him having no conditions requiring them. Drugs that affected mood, behavior, and sleep patterns. Dr. Patricia Winters, a child psychiatrist who reviewed the records, characterized this as concerning at best, abusive at worst. These medications would make a child more compliant, less emotionally reactive, Dr. Winters explained. Combined with psychological conditioning, they could create a child who becomes whatever the adult wants them to be. Former patients of Victoria's pediatric practice came forward with stories of unusual prescribing patterns. Several parents reported being encouraged to medicate their children for minor behavioral issues, with Victoria emphasizing how the medications would make their lives easier and their children more manageable. The state medical board launched an investigation into Victoria's practice, uncovering evidence that she had been diverting medications for personal use and falsifying records to cover her tracks. She wasn't just a doctor who went astray, notes medical board investigator Terrence Washington. She systematically exploited her position to access controlled substances and manipulate vulnerable patients, including Eli. Cooper interviewed Richard in depth about his relationship with his adopted son. Though initially defensive, Richard eventually acknowledged the signs he had missed. Eli always knew exactly what I wanted to hear, he admitted. When I talked about the country club, he'd say how much he loved golf. When I mentioned the foundation, he'd say how important it was to help other kids like him. Richard paused, his expression haunted. But there was this one night. I found him in my office, going through my files on Mrs. Wilson's estate. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "Helping us get what we deserve, Dad." Something in his eyes. It wasn't a child looking back at me. Financial records revealed Victoria stood to gain substantially more from Mrs. Wilson's death than previously known. The foundation wasn't just named as a beneficiary. Victoria had maneuvered to become its sole controlling officer, with provisions that would allow her to allocate funds for administrative purposes without oversight. Dr. Freeman's continued sessions with Eli yielded concerning insights. He presents differently, depending on who's in the room, she noted. With male authority figures, he's respectful but guarded. With female caregivers, he's vulnerable and seeking protection. It's not the normal adaptability children show. It's a calculated assessment of what each adult wants from him. Most disturbing was the discovery of a hidden diary in Victoria's private storage unit, separated from the evidence Cooper had initially found. The entries detailed her first meetings with Eli 3 years before the adoption, far earlier than either Victoria or Richard had claimed. Found the perfect partner today, one entry read. Only 9 years old but already understands how the world really works. He sees through people like I do. Together we can fix everything. Another entry, dated just after the adoption was finalized. R thinks it's his idea to target Wilson. Doesn't realize E suggested it first. My beautiful, brilliant boy. He's better at this than I am. The relationship depicted wasn't mother and son, but something closer to conspirators, with an increasingly unclear power dynamic. As Cooper assembled this evidence, Victoria was spotted at a bus station in Chicago, purchasing a ticket to Canada. Local police moved to apprehend her, but dashcam footage shows what happened next. Victoria attempting to flee on foot, then stopping suddenly, her hand going to her chest before she collapsed on the sidewalk. The official cause of death: acute cardiac arrest from a lethal combination of prescription medications, the same medications found in Mrs. Wilson's system. Toxicology would later reveal Victoria had consumed them approximately 2 hours before being spotted at the station, in a cup of tea. Victoria Palmer's death left authorities with a case that defied simple categorization. Was it suicide? A desperate final act to escape justice, or something more sinister? The toxicology report offered no definitive answers, only the cold fact that the same medication cocktail that killed Mrs. Wilson had claimed Victoria's life. With Victoria gone and Richard cleared, all eyes turned to Eli Granger, no longer viewed simply as a victim, but as a potential participant in a scheme that had claimed 2 lives. The legal system, however, was ill-equipped to handle the complexities of this case. "We're talking about an 11-year-old child," District Attorney Sarah Morrison explained to the press. "Regardless of the evidence, we have to balance justice with the realities of his age and the influences he was under." Cooper continued building his case methodically, now focusing on separating Eli's actions from Victoria's influence. Through careful interviews with Eli's previous foster families, teachers, and social workers, a clearer picture began to emerge. He was always 2 steps ahead, former foster parent Samuel Davis explained. When we confronted him about Mrs. Kravitz's spoons, he'd already prepared a story about how she'd promised them to him. He had actual tears in his eyes when he told it, made us doubt ourselves for even questioning him. Richard, still processing his own role in the events, attempted to reconnect with Eli during supervised visits. These interactions, recorded as part of the investigation, revealed subtle dynamics that raised further concerns. "You did what you had to do, Dad," Eli told Richard during one such visit, his voice carrying the practiced empathy Dr. Freeman had noted in her assessments. "Just like I did. Mom said sometimes the world doesn't give people like us what we deserve, so we have to take it." When Richard asked about Victoria's involvement with Mrs. Wilson, Eli's response was chillingly matter-of-fact. "Mom said you were too scared to do what needed to be done. She said I was braver than you." The most revealing moment came during a pivotal session with Dr. Freeman and Cooper. As they discussed Mrs. Wilson, Eli recounted helping her in her garden, describing how she had taught him about different flowers. "She loved hydrangeas," Eli said, his expression shifting to the exact same unnerving smile that had appeared in the courtroom during his hearing. "She showed me how to make the blue ones turn pink by changing the soil. It's all about controlling the environment." The moment created a chilling mirror effect that left both professionals deeply disturbed. This wasn't a traumatized child slipping into dissociation. It was a deliberate demonstration. In that moment, Dr. Freeman later testified, he wanted us to see behind the mask. It was almost as if he was tired of performing and wanted recognition for his true abilities. As the case developed, public opinion fractured. Some viewed Eli as a victim of Victoria's manipulation and the system's failures. Others saw a disturbed child who had developed dangerous adaptive behaviors through years of institutional neglect. Local ministers organized prayer vigils. Child advocacy groups issued statements about the failures of the foster care system. The most concrete evidence emerged when Cooper discovered Victoria's hidden diary containing entries that suggested Eli had begun operating independently of her control. "He is taking initiative I didn't authorize," one entry read. "Found evidence he's been meeting W without me. When confronted, he said he was accelerating the timeline. He's becoming unpredictable. Not sure who's guiding whom anymore." Another entry, dated just 2 weeks before Mrs. Wilson's collapse. E suggested we could apply the same approach to R if necessary. Said it so casually, like discussing a math problem. Had to remind him R is his father. He just shrugged and said, "Only on paper." Something is changing in him. Or maybe it was always there and I just didn't want to see it. Cooper's investigation reached a critical juncture when he received a call from Chicago police. Among Victoria's possessions recovered at the bus station was a phone with a video recorded the morning of her death, showing Eli methodically preparing a cup of tea, adding medication from Victoria's own supply, and handing it to her with a gentle smile. "One last cup before your trip," his voice can be heard saying, "just like we used to make for Mrs. Wilson." The final preparations for Victoria's trial had shifted to a juvenile proceeding against Eli Granger. The legal system, designed with clear boundaries between adult and child offenders, struggled with the unprecedented nature of the case. How does society judge a child whose actions suggest adult calculation, but whose brain development remains unfinished? This case exposes the gaping holes in our juvenile justice framework, explains child welfare attorney Rebecca Torres. The system assumes children can be either victims or perpetrators, but Eli exists in a disturbing gray area between the two. Cooper and a specialized child psychology team conducted a series of interviews with Eli, gradually working to break through his rehearsed responses. With each session, the facade cracked further. "I just wanted a family," Eli said during one interview, tears streaming down his face in what appeared to be genuine emotion. Until Cooper mentioned Victoria's final video, the tears stopped instantly, replaced by a calculating look that seemed decades older than his 11 years. "She was going to leave me behind," Eli said flatly, "just like everyone always does. I couldn't let that happen." National media coverage exposed how common such cases might be, with experts revealing that approximately 1,500 children annually are adopted into homes where the primary motivation isn't nurturing, but financial or social advantage. The Palmer case became a rallying point for system reform, with congressional hearings featuring testimony from former foster children about exploitation they had experienced. Richard Palmer, still processing his own unwitting role in the tragedy, attempted reconciliation with his adopted son. In their final supervised visit, recorded by authorities, Richard asked the question that had haunted him through his jail time and beyond. "Did you ever think of me as your father?" Eli's response was measured, his voice soft but eerily adult. "I thought of you as what I needed you to be. Sometimes that was a father. Sometimes it was a tool. It depended on what would work best." The medical examiner's final report confirmed Mrs. Wilson died from medication prescribed by Victoria, but administered through tea over several weeks, the same method used in Victoria's death. Fingerprint analysis revealed both Eli's and Victoria's prints on the medication containers and teacups in both cases. "We believe Victoria initiated the medication tampering with Mrs. Wilson," explained forensic psychiatrist Dr. Howard Klein. "But evidence suggests Eli quickly became not just a participant, but eventually took control of the situation. The student became the master, so to speak." The prosecution faced an unprecedented dilemma: charge Eli as a juvenile accomplice, recognizing his role while acknowledging the influences that shaped him, or treat him primarily as a victim of Victoria's manipulation and the system's failures. The decision would set precedents for similar cases nationwide. District Attorney 6 Attorney Morrison summarized the challenge. "We're attempting to balance justice for Mrs. Wilson and accountability for severe actions with the understanding that this child was systematically failed by every adult and institution tasked with protecting him." Public opinion remained sharply divided. Outside the courthouse, competing groups gathered daily, some with signs reading, "Justice for Harriet," and others with, "Protect Eli." The case had become a national inflection point for discussions about juvenile justice, mental health, and the foster care system. As the final hearing approached, Cooper received a package at the sheriff's office. Inside was a USB drive labeled "The Truth" in childlike handwriting. The return address, the juvenile detention center where Eli was being held. "I expected a confession," Cooper recalls. "What I found was something far more disturbing, a manifesto. Not the ramblings of a disturbed child, but a methodical documentation that would force us to confront who Eli Granger really was and what he had been doing long before the Palmers entered his life. The contents of that drive would shatter every assumption about the case and force the justice system to face its most difficult question. What do we do when a child learns to become exactly what a broken system creates? The USB drive contained over 100 video files, meticulously organized and dated. Eli had secretly recorded conversations throughout his time with the Palmers using devices hidden in his toys, backpack, and even a teddy bear camera he had ordered online using Richard's credit card. He documented everything, Cooper explains, still visibly affected by what he witnessed. Not as evidence against others, but as a record of his own evolution, like a twisted project. Journal. The videos revealed the true dynamics of the Palmer household. Early footage showed Victoria approaching Eli with her scheme to target wealthy elderly neighbors, presenting it as a game they would play together. "People like us have to be smarter than everyone else," she told him. "That's, how we get what we deserve." But later videos documented Eli's progression from Victoria's pupil to something else entirely. In one clip, he calmly explained to Victoria how they could modify their approach to accelerate Mrs. Wilson's decline. In another, he suggested targeting Richard next if he became a liability. Most disturbing were Eli's private recordings, video diaries where he spoke directly to the camera about his experiments with the Palmers. "Victoria thinks she found me, but I chose her," he explained in one entry, his voice devoid of childlike qualities. "I recognized what she was the first day we met. She saw a tool. I saw a teacher." The final video, recorded the night before Victoria fled, showed Eli methodically preparing the medications that would later kill her. "She's becoming unpredictable," he said to the camera. "Too emotional. Too much of a risk. The system requires precision." When these videos were presented in court, legal precedent crumbled. This wasn't a child manipulated by adults. This was something psychology lacked adequate terminology to describe. A mind that had adapted to years of institutional neglect by learning to perfectly mirror what each foster family wanted while calculating his own advancement. Judge Harold Simmons faced an impossible decision. The legal system had no framework for a child who had been both victim and perpetrator, both manipulated and manipulator. His unprecedented ruling sent shockwaves through the judicial system. Eli would be tried as a juvenile, but placed in a specialized secure treatment facility until at least age 21, with mandatory psychological evaluation before any potential release. "The court sentences a child today," Simmons stated in his ruling, "but it was the adults who made him. In my 40 years on the bench, I have never encountered a case that so clearly demonstrates how our systems can fail those they're designed to protect, and how those failures can ripple outward to destroy multiple lives." Richard Palmer watched from the gallery as his adopted son was led away. When asked by reporters if he had any comment, he simply said, "I thought I was using the system to get what I wanted. I never realized the system had created someone who was using me. My name is Martha Holloway, and I've spent my career studying cases like this one. But the story of Eli Granger isn't just about one disturbed child or one broken family. It's about what happens when truth becomes a weapon, when institutions protect themselves instead of the vulnerable, and when justice arrives too late to save the innocent. The system didn't just fail Eli Granger, it created him. And the question that haunts Millbrook to this day isn't why this happened, but how many more Elis are out there, waiting for their moment.